Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Coast-to-Coast Combat Hour. I'm your host, Matthew Hawkins, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Ed Carbajal. And on a weekly basis, we plan to bring you the biggest news and interviews in the world of combat sports. Ed, you got a little smile on your face over there. What's going on, man?
I just realized that. So when I started the Hangout, I just got a message that Hangouts on Air is going away this year. YouTube. That's how they let us know. Huh. All
Well,
right.
we'll have to adjust into Skype with some of our other guests.
Yeah.
Speaking of guests, this week we're happy to be joined by friend of the show, MMA medical man John Lucas, who worked the UFC Greenville card this past weekend. John, how you doing?
Great, thanks.
So
Glad.
so
Go
so
ahead, Ed.
John, what is your technical term for when you get called on I know they didn't license you as medical man.
Yeah, so I mean, ringside physician or event.
That's right. That's
I
right.
was
Yeah.
the technically it was the chief physician for the event was my exact title.
The So you've worked several shows, smaller events, King of the Cage, boxing events. I see you post about. This was the first time the UFC had ever come to South Carolina. Tell us a little bit about the experience and maybe some of the advantages to the UFC as opposed to the smaller shows, or if there was anything that was negative about it. How was the experience in general?
Yeah, so I mean, in short, the experience was outstanding. I had really high expectations of the UFC from a medical standpoint, since they're the premier MMA organization, or really, I think the premier fight sport organization in the world, certainly in the country. And they've got a lot of money at stake and a lot of world class athletes. And even though I had really high expectations, I was just blown away by the job that the UFC medical crew does with taking care of the fighters before the fight, during the fight, after the fight, and catering to um, really catering to the fighters just in general. There's been a couple of interviews with guys who were new to the UFC since then. So like Darren Wynn, for instance, was talking to Ariel Helwani about how surprised he was at all the different things the UFC did to help him out. If you need something for your weight cut, they put you in touch with who you need, give you a ride here, give you a ride there, call this person, do this thing. They really do an outstanding job.
So from your I know you've this is not this is not the first event you've officiated for, but from the Greenville event, I mean, what stood out to you? I know Matt was sending me some screenshots of you doing your work, but like how busy of a night is it for you? Is it like high pace, high stress?
Yeah, in this event, I've lost track of how many MMA events that I've worked, but it's got to be close to, if not over 100 by now. And this was by far the busiest I was ever at any one of the events. And normally, when I'm working an event, I'm the only physician there. Where at this event, I had four other physicians and a nurse who were helping me out. So I wasn't doing like the actual post-fight physicals and stuff like that. I didn't do any of the suturing, but I was still running around like a chicken with my head cut off for quite a bit of the night because of how many injuries and decisions had to be made throughout the event.
When we saw you on TV and actually in the cage, and is that a position that do they tell you? You're supposed to go stand in there. Is it something you kind of took upon yourself to kind of be in the right place at the right time? And I mean, I don't know exactly what. Are you just there to make sure that the fighter doesn't run out of the cage without seeing you?
Well, the going into the cage is something that I started doing a number of years ago at the smaller events for a couple of reasons. One, at the smaller events, if the fighter leaves the cage or a boxing event leaves the ring without seeing me, I may never see
Mhm.
them again. That's one of the biggest problems I have at smaller events is literally losing track of a fighter. I've got somebody I want to check back into later. They go back to the dressing room and, either at an intermission or when the event's over, I go back looking for them and they're just gone. So I started going into the either the ring or the cage between every single round, and then going into the cage after the actual fight was over a number of years ago. And I talked to the UFC folks to make sure they were okay with me doing that, and they had no problem with that at all. So they didn't ask me to position myself anywhere in particular. I generally try to get behind the camera so that I'm not on camera, but I wasn't 100% obviously successful in that. And a couple of times when Bisping started doing his interview, the fighter would be facing in one direction and then they would move to his other side. So the cameraman would walk around the cage and it's just not worth my time to try to sprint, to keep ahead of them. So once in a while I wound up being on camera standing right by the door there. But I'm just trying to stand out of the way and be inconspicuous as possible, but be able to keep eyeballs on either which the fighter that I think was hurt, or to make sure that the physician who's actually going to grab the fighter and walk him back to the medical tent afterwards is going to be able to get with them and get the post-fight physical done.
So you have a close connection. I know we've talked about it before when you're on the podcast with Wonder Boy and the school out there. I had read I wrote a piece about it because I had read how Stephen Thompson and his dad Ray Thompson had a hand in getting the event out to Greenville. So from what you saw, obviously you're speaking highly of it. What's the likelihood of them coming out there again?
I mean, I would like to think the likelihood is high. I was pretty concerned about that leading up to the event, because this event seemed to get a lot less press and a lot less promotion from the UFC than a lot of the other fight nights that they've done in smaller markets. And there was very few, I mean, really, there was no true local fighters on the card, where there was some people in the immediate Greenville, Spartanburg, Anderson area that are probably very close to UFC caliber, or UFC caliber just haven't made the jump yet. With the best example of that probably being Carl Reed, who trains with us, who's going to be on the Contender Series in the very near future. I was really surprised that they didn't scrap his Contender contract and give him an undercard fight. That would have gone a long way towards filling some more seats. But once the event got started, there was a decent crowd. There was a little over 7,000 people there. There was good energy in the arena, and then watching it on TV, it looked like that the energy from the crowd transmitted pretty well on the broadcast. And the UFC folks seemed very happy with the way the medical team worked, and very happy with the way the interactions with the commission went. So hopefully we'll see them back in the state for another show sometime in the future.
Yeah, because I know that originally the intention was to have Wonder Boy on that card because of how close it is to where you guys all live. Obviously, with the loss to Pettis, he couldn't do that. But so I was just curious. The other thing you just mentioned something that maybe Matt, I'd like to get Matt's opinion on this, just because he and I talk about it in private a lot. But do you think that the marketing for these fight nights is not as good as it used to be for previous fight nights because of the way it is on the ESPN Plus, or just because of where it is?
I don't really have a good handle on that. I mean, I do definitely feel like the marketing is not quite as robust as it was before. I don't know if they've had a shift in the way they market these.
Yeah.
I just saw some Facebook ads, and I think there was a couple of billboards right outside the arena about it, but it seemed like it wasn't that long ago that when there was a UFC fight, you couldn't look anywhere without seeing it, hearing it, and having it blasted. So I'm not exactly sure why there's been a change.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Obviously, it's less than it used to be. I think it's kind of a case by case basis. I feel like this event probably was not cursed, but when Steven couldn't compete on it, I think the UFC kind of realized the idea of maybe selling 12,000 tickets was kind of out the door. You're going to sell your 6,000 to 8,000 just based off of it being a UFC event. So maybe you just kind of take your ball and go home and just kind of know what you're going to get. Whereas if Steven was on the card, I imagine he would have been doing a lot of local promotion stuff, probably would have been on the your morning news channels, kind of stuff like that. Probably would have been a little bit more visible. But with that said, like in the Tennessee fight where Steven fought Anthony Pettis, there was a few billboards, but not a lot of stuff around town. I don't know. The ticket sales have been weird. John and I were actually talking about this about the week prior, looking at the tickets, and it looked like there was a bunch still open for Greenville, but it was mainly the cheaper seats. And when it's the cheaper seats, you usually get a pretty good walk up because the teenage kid or the person that doesn't have a lot of money can show up to the gate with $50 and figure out how to get in the door. Whereas like the UFC event next weekend, there's still quite a few. There's a couple thousand tickets still available, and that's for the I mean, that's considered. A lot of people consider it the card of the year up until this point. But I think that's Vegas. I think people are just kind of. I think it's burnt out. Maybe you've burnt out the local crowd in Vegas a little bit. It's not the same as it was years ago.
Yeah.
They've got, everybody in Vegas who's a fight fan's been to probably several fights. But then you look at the August event, UFC 241, that really hasn't even gotten any kind of media or any kind of backing yet. I'm not seeing commercials on TV for it or anything. I just looked before we came on the air here, and there's literally probably 22 seats left for the entire event in a 20,000 seat arena, the Honda Center. And
Mm.
the seats that are available, I think the cheapest seat that I saw was like $900. It's all the platinum seats around the cage that usually don't sell up until right to the event when some or they end up giving them away. So it's just kind of a weird dynamic. I know Diaz is scheduled for that card. Obviously, DC and Miocic is still a big heavyweight fight, but I was surprised to see that. I haven't seen a UFC event sell like that in a long time. So I don't know. I think they just kind of maybe know their markets. They know what they're going to sell, no matter how much money they put into promotion, and they're kind of just go by that. Maybe if they thought they were in a bigger market. I've never been to South Carolina, John, so I don't know exactly. If they were going to have a big pay-per-view event, would it be at that arena, or would there be another city or somewhere else that they would most likely go to?
I mean, there's definitely bigger arenas around. They could go to USC in Columbia and use their basketball arena or something like that. But the I think that Greenville, and I'm obviously biased because I live here, but I think Greenville is sort of the ideal destination for the UFC in South Carolina because it's positioned almost exactly halfway between Charlotte and Atlanta.
Mm.
Very easy to get to by air from almost everywhere else in the country. And if they had a little bit, I think either more local fighters or a couple of bigger names on the card, they would have had no problem selling the entire arena out.
Yeah, because they only had like 7,095 or something like that attendance. So
Yeah.
how many people does that arena seat?
I think it seats somewhere around twice that. And I say that because they didn't use the upper bowl at all, except for 2 rows of seats sort of from blue line to blue line. That arena is a hockey barn, so it's fairly steep and there's 2 levels. There's the floor, the first level of bleachers or first level of stands, and then another level on top of that. And they had the upper level was basically entirely blacked out.
Well, I mean, yeah, I imagine you get some bigger names, like you said, some local fighters. Uh, but the crowd, when I saw it, what was it, like 7,700 or something like that? That's not too bad. I mean, that's very comparable to your average Bellator show. Um, Maybe like the Fitch McDonald fight in April. I mean, they cut off half of their arena because they have their stage and stuff, so they're not. It doesn't look maybe as empty as that, but you know, if you told me there was an event in South Carolina that had around 8,000 people, I would think that that's a fairly solid crowd. I feel like the older events in Cincinnati and stuff kind of used to have that same number. That was kind of the original fight night before they started getting them a little bit deeper with the cards.
Yeah, and I don't know how the UFC felt about how the fight sold, but especially with the late push they had with all the tickets that sold, I sent you the screenshot from Ticketmaster 5 or 6 days out, and
Mm.
I looked again on Friday, and probably 75 or 80% of the seats that were available earlier in the week had been sold. There really weren't that many seats in the tickets that they made available that didn't wind up selling. So I think they're probably pretty happy with the attendance they got.
Well, that's
Yeah,
good to hear. Yeah, we need some more East Coast events.
with now obviously you're there to do a job, but I mean I think it's fair to say you do the MMA. Oh, I shouldn't speak for you, but you do it as a job. A lot of times I know you do it kind of as not charity, but you don't necessarily take payments for the smaller shows. You've told me in the past you kind of do it to just to make sure that there's a good eye on the fighters in case they need help medically. But being a fan, knowing that you are, I mean, we're going to meet up next weekend in Vegas for the big fight. What when you're working that event, are you able to enjoy the fights? I mean, obviously there was some exciting fights, or I've found it when covering an event, sometimes you feel like you're doing a job, so it kind of takes away from the enjoyment. Did you find that to be the case, or were you able to actually enjoy the fights at all?
I mean, I enjoy doing the ringside medicine, but it's very different than like next weekend when you and I are in Vegas just watching the fights. I watch the fights very differently when I'm there working versus when I'm just watching as a fan. And the reason why I enjoy it is different. So, I mean, I definitely enjoyed the fights, But when I came back home and then watched the replays on ESPN Plus, it was very, very different than the experience of sitting there. Because when you're sitting there and you're responsible for making decisions about, is this fight going to continue? Are they hurt? What am I going to look for between rounds and whatnot? I end up concentrating almost entirely on whoever is losing the fight or whoever's taking the most damage. And by concentrating so much on that one fighter, it's very difficult to appreciate the beauty of what the other person's doing, particularly standing, because I don't usually actually see the strike until it's making contact with the fighter who I was worried about in the first place. So there's a lot of things like in the Luis Pena fight when Violent Bob Ross threw that fake uppercut into flying knee. I just saw that as a flying knee because I was staring at Matt the whole time trying to decide whether that cut was going to be something that was going to be an issue or not. And it wasn't until I saw the replay that I saw how he set that up. I mean, that was just amazing. So I guess the answer to your question is, yeah, I enjoyed it, but for a very different reason than when I'm there as just a fan.
Was that the most significant work you had to do as far as like concerned with cuts and injuries? From I see there was 1, 2, 3, 4 finishes on that card. Was that the one that was most concerning?
Yeah, I mean that cut was definitely the one that was most concerning. I mean, I don't know if you watched the broadcast, you could hear that when I went into the cage during the first round to look at Matt's cut, Dan was already talking to the commission about the fact that it was a legal strike and was in the process of letting them know that, because he thought I was going to stop the fight, and he actually even said on air, "He's good," like a question. He was clearly surprised that I let that continue, but I kind of have a criteria in my head of what a cut can look like, where it can be, how deep it can be, how big it can be, and let the fight continue and not. And that cut was, definitely the most significant cut I've ever dealt with, and I've allowed a fight to continue. But there were a couple of other times during the event where I thought I was going to have to step in and do something, but fortunately didn't. So yeah, I guess in retrospect, that was definitely the hardest medical decision of that event.
Were there any fights that, I mean, as a fan, I guess, that you got that surprised you in the night? I mean, were there what fights stood out to you?
So I have to admit, I kind of thought that the Korean Zombie was going to win his fight, but I wasn't expecting him to do it in the fashion that he did. I think that surprised everybody. And I was also very surprised to see Bam Bam Barberina's fight go the way that it did. I was, partially because I've worked a couple of fights he's fought in before. I kind of thought that Bam Bam was going to be able to handle that. And unfortunately, the fight just didn't go his way.
Yeah, Chan Sung Jung, the Korean Zombie, dropped Moicano about 25 seconds into the fight with a big right hand punch, and then finished with some ground and pound about a minute into the first round. And as he speaks, the co-main event, Brian Barberina suffered a loss due to knees and punches in the middle of the final round of that fight. Yeah, I mean, those were two good fights. I thought Andrea Lee, I've mentioned several times, I'm a big fan of her. I thought she looked really good, and she did a number on Montana De La Rosa, bloodied her up a little bit too. Were there? I mean, I don't know how much you can say if there's certain secrets, or not secrets, but stuff they don't say. How many of the fighters ended up in the hospital? Were there any scares other than the visual stuff that you had to deal with mainly in the Wyman fight?
Just some people who got, hit a lot and either had a big cut that we wanted to make sure there wasn't anything more significant going on under it, or it took a lot of punches and had some neurologic signs after. We wanted to make sure we're just them being tired and not something more significant. So we sent a couple people to the hospital for further follow-up, but nobody got, any sort of significant injury that's going to be a long-term problem for them.
During the I don't know if it was during the weigh-ins. It was prior to the event. John Lineker was pulled, and I believe they said it was for a cut over his eye.
That's correct.
Was he in? Did you get to see that, or was that determined by somebody else before it got to you?
That was determined by his team. His team made that decision without any input from the medical service. I'd actually talked. That's the first inkling of how good the UFC's medical team was. I was sitting at home on Thursday night and got a phone call from the UFC medical director to let me know that had happened, and that he had a couple of his people look at it. They sent some pictures back and forth, and they had the plan was they had sent him to get the cut addressed, and then I was going to look at him before physicals the next morning to make sure I was comfortable with him continuing to fight. But sometime between that conversation and the next morning, his team decided that he wasn't going to continue on, so I never actually saw him at all.
When when fighters gets into the hospital as the ringside physician, is that your call to make officially, or is it a consensus of medical staff there?
I mean, since the UFC physician, the medical director, wasn't able to be at this event, so it was entirely my call. I'm sure if there was someone that they thought should go to the hospital based on what they were seeing on TV or hearing, I'm sure that the medical staff there would have sent them, even if I didn't think it was necessary. But there was not any sort of disagreement like that. So yeah, it was myself and the other physicians. When we had somebody who we thought needed to go, we sent them, and then went and followed up with them to make sure everything was all right.
When you go into the cage, that's one thing I want to ask too. There was usually another gentleman who seemed to be in there standing next to you. Is he a commission member or is that a second doctor?
No, so the way the UFC does the medical stuff at their events, and if you watch events on TV, you'll see this occasionally. They usually have 5 physicians there, sometimes 6 if Jeff Davidson, who's the medical director of the UFC, is there. But they'll have 2 physicians in the red corner, 2 physicians in the blue corner, and then somebody in the back who's going to do all the suturing and whatnot. So we had 2 people sitting in the red corner, 2 people sitting in the blue corner, and then I was sitting right at the cage door next to a couple of the commissioners. Since I have quite a bit of experience at MMA events, I wanted to be the person who was going to make any final decisions about, yeah, we're stopping this, no, we're not. So every time they called a physician in, whichever one of the 2, I had the people in each corner had a odd number team and an even number team. So if it was, fight number 1, 3, 5, 7, the odd number team would be the ones who were going in, and then vice versa, the even number team would do it. So when I went in, whoever was assigned to the corner that we were evaluating would come in too. So the guy you're talking about most of the time, the guy that had black hair, is a little taller than me, put his glasses on once. He's another physician. He's an orthopedic surgeon. He's actually a former professional football player. And then I had an orthopedic surgeon, a trauma surgeon, a vascular surgeon, and a neurosurgeon as the other physicians who were there. So we had 2 of the guys, the vascular surgeon and the neurosurgeon, have both worked a number of events, sometimes with me and sometimes by themselves. And they actually own a fight gym up the street, and they run a company called the Fight Doctor. So they're very, very into fight sports and very experienced. Dr. Sifri, the orthopedic surgeon, worked the first couple of MMA events I ever worked at ironically at the same place. It was called the Bilo Center back then, back when Brett Moses used to do the fight party events. And then the trauma surgeon was there as the suture doc.
Wow, so you had quite a team then. I mean,
yeah.
Is that when you do your other events? You said you've done approximately 100, give or take. What percentage of those are you by yourself?
99. And it's a totally different experience then, because like here, so take the Matt Wyman Violent Bob Ross fight, big cut, go in. Here, I know I've got a trauma surgeon in the back who's going to be able to suture, the cut as long as it's not medically dangerous. He's going to be able to do it the instant the fight's over. And if there's any more concerns, there was 4 ambulances there with complete ACLS crews for transport. The level 1 trauma center, which was 5 minutes away, was on standby. They knew the event was going on. The UFC had already communicated with them, and they had a whole plan of how things were going to go if there was an issue. So, have absolute world-class medical care at your fingertips, where normally when I'm at an event, it's just me. So that means I go in, look at that cut. I'm going to have to fix it. But if I fix it, it's going to be at the end of the event, because if I try to do it between fights, it's going to delay the event by, an hour and a half, 2 hours while I do that. So it's a whole different ball of wax.
Do you ever get anybody arguing with you when you have to stop a fight, as far as like the not the fighter? Obviously the fighter will argue, but like corners and cornermen and stuff.
Yeah, I've had it that actually happened pretty recently, and I was half joking with the commissioner that I was sitting next to after I let the Matt Winman fight go on. A couple of months ago, there was a pro boxing event that I was at, and they had a couple guys collided heads, and one of them got a cut that wasn't very big, but it was right on his eyelid. Oof. So it's a dangerous place. And it was like probably 3 minutes or 2 minutes into the first round, so there was still some time left. and there's no cut man there that's going to fix it. It's just, his corner between rounds. So I stopped that fight, and the boxer himself, more so his corner, and even more so his manager / promoter, were, I mean, really mad. They were yelling, and I had words with the corner at the time I made the decision, and then as soon as the fight was over, his manager came over and started telling me that I shouldn't have stopped that fight, don't need to, and told him I try very hard not to be arrogant during these events, but I told him, I said, well, there's only one person in this building that's the physician that's making those decisions, and it's me. And I said, if you don't agree with the decision, the commissioner's sitting right there. Tell them. They'll be more than happy to bring it up. And I said, and we can bring in every medical or every ringside physician in the country and show them the tape of where the cut was and what it looked like, and get a consensus on whether they would have stopped it or not. I said, it's a bad spot. It's a no-brainer. That's a cut that's going to be stopped every single time.
Yeah,
and
it seems.
Well, we stopped it. We stopped it from bleeding with Vaseline between rounds. I'm like, that's great, but you can't do that in the middle of the round, and he still has a cut in his eyelid. If he gets hit there again and his eyelid splits open, that could end his career.
Yeah, it seems like more times than not that usually after the adrenaline and everything calms down, they're more grateful for what you do versus when they're arguing with you after. Like I think about Leslie Smith, I think it was when her ear was falling off.
Yeah,
How she was fighting about like wanting to continue, but then obviously later when she finally saw what her ear looked like, she was like, oh yeah, I'm glad they stopped that.
Yeah, and I had the opposite concern after I walked out of the cage with the Wyman fight. I sat down and I'm like, I feel very comfortable that fight is not likely to end up in any sort of permanent disfigurement for him. He obviously wanted to continue, but I don't really take the fighter wanting to continue isn't a reason necessarily not to stop the fight. But the converse is true. If the fighter clearly looks like they're not interested in continuing, then I'll tell them, hey, if you don't want to continue, tell me and I'll stop it. And the crowd can boo me, and you can complain all you want on social media that, oh, the doctor shouldn't have stopped it, but you can get out of this. But it was very clear by what he said as he was coming over, he didn't want that stop. But when I sat back down, I was a little concerned that when I talked with the UFC afterwards, and particularly since Dan seemed so surprised that I didn't stop the fight, that they were going to be irritated that I let that go on. But I had a long discussion with a number of people from the UFC, and there's no negative blowback at all from that. I don't know Matt at all, so I don't have any way of asking him how he and his corner feel about that. But I get the sense that they were perfectly happy with him continuing. And I really thought Dan did a great job stopping that. He's gotten some grief online about letting it go on too long. But as the person who was sitting there watching him, he was defending himself intelligently until about 3 seconds before Dan stopped it. He finally took a couple of shots and stopped going for De La Riva and taking the back and defending. And he was clearly done, and Dan stopped it almost immediately. And I thought he did a perfect job with that fight.
Is there any, this might sound kind of like a stupid question, but is there any cuts is it basically all location? I mean, we've seen guys with their skull basically showing, but if it's in certain spots, they let it go. Would you ever, I'm not saying you would change your opinion because you're doing a UFC event. Obviously, if it's an amateur event, you're looking out for the fighter perhaps a little more than, again, not putting words in your mouth, but that's how I imagine it would be. Is there any, if a guy gets a hatchet wound, but it's not in a bad spot on his face, is that still a fight that gets stopped nowadays? They used to stop fights a lot more in the first 15 years of the sport. And it seems like obviously the medical world's educated a little bit as far as what the actual dangers are. You understand what I'm kind of asking?
Absolutely. And it's a great question. And I think that there's a couple of different things at play. So first off, the cutmen they have in the UFC in particular, but cutmen in general, are worlds ahead of where they were 5-10 years ago, as far as getting cuts to stop bleeding and things like that between rounds. And that's one thing that the unsung hero of that fight is really Rob Monroe, who was the cutman for the red corner on that fight. Because I spoke with a cutman before the event started, and I told him, I said, when the bell rings at the end of a round, I'm going to be the last guy in the ring and the first guy out. So you guys get the entire minute to work a cut. I'm not going to push you out of the way and try to look at a cut and make a decision. You do your thing until you hear the 10-second clap. And then when you leave, that's when I'll make my decision. And Rob got that thing dry as a bone between rounds 1 and 2, and again between rounds 2 and 3. Just did a fantastic job. So having really competent cutmen like that makes a big difference. And then the other thing is, because there's so many more physicians involved in fight sports over the last 5 to 10 years, there's actually some pretty good data and some good opinions and lectures and references about what cuts are dangerous and what cuts aren't. So location matters, whether the cut's obstructing their vision either by their tissue kind of falling down over their eye or the cut bleeding into their eye makes a big difference. And then size does make a difference. I mean, a cut can only be so big, and I would be willing to let it continue. So, I mean, if the cut that Matt had been even like a centimeter bigger, especially medially, so it crossed sort of the middle of his orbit, I would have stopped it for sure. But that cut was up above his eyebrow. It wasn't into the ocular muscles, so he was still able to move his eyelid normally. And it wasn't quite gaping enough for the tissue of his eyebrow and eyelid to be flopping down into his eye. And it was bleeding to his eyebrow and then down the inside of his nose, and then on the other side, outside of his eye. So when he was standing up or when he was laying on the ground, because of how high it wasn't bleeding directly into his eye. So it was just small enough to not make me want to stop it, just not quite deep enough to make me want to stop it. It was in a fairly safe area, and it wasn't bleeding into his eye. So the danger area, if you think of the 6-pack rings, like the little plastic 6 rings you would get around a 6-pack of beer.
Yeah.
You take one of those and hold the top rings right on the sort of the medial, just inside of your eye by your nose. Those are kind of the 6 danger areas. So the inside corner of your eye into the medial half of your orbit, there's a nerve that comes out there. So a deep cut there is one to stop. Just lateral to the nose, there's another nerve that comes out in your face. So that's a place that a deep cut could be seriously disfiguring. And then the vermilion border, right where your lip color starts on your lip, is another place that if you get a cut, you generally want to stop, because if that extends, it's going to go into the interior of your mouth, and you start having problems with a big cut like that literally splits your lip open. So those are kind of the high risk areas.
Interesting.
That's like the Robbie Lawler cut from UFC 189.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting, because I never really thought, I mean, as a fan, I didn't think about it necessarily as nerve damage, but I guess that's what once you get below
No.
the first couple layers, and that's what you start dealing with. I mean, obviously,
You're also a savage, Matt.
yeah. And I'm going to ask one more question, getting back to the eyelid one, just curiosity again. So one of the famous ones is UFC 46, where it was Couture and Belfort, and Belfort won the light heavyweight title with a cut on the eyelid. Without getting too graphic, is that basically because a cut on the eyelid? When you said it could be split open, does that essentially mean like eyelid ripped off? Is that where we're going with that?
Ripped in the middle like curtains on a stage. So repairing that is extremely difficult, because
Imagine.
I won't touch an eyelid laceration with a 10-foot pole. I send them to the ER and let plastic surgery or ophthalmology or somebody deal with those, because they're very difficult to repair and very easy to do something that would be potentially devastating for the fighter if you don't repair it perfectly. So those lacerations are a big deal.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I just as a fan's perspective, again, when sometimes you'll see a guy and he'll have a 4-inch cut and they'll let it go, and then I've seen fans complain that well, it's just on the eyelid, but it's only a half an inch cut, but it's right there. So that makes sense. And obviously, if you can't shut your eye or damage your eyelid that severely, your forget your fight career, your livelihood could could seem like it could take a hit. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's interesting. Were you able to catch up on any of the other fights over the weekend? The bare knuckle boxing or the Bellator event at all?
I've seen and heard a little bit about the events, but I haven't actually sat down and watched the entire thing. So just a couple of clips here and there and some chatter. But I was so busy the night of the event, and then following up, I was up until about 2:00 in the morning with a fighter in the ER with the UFC folks, and then somebody else who had been discharged was having some issues a little later on in the morning, like around 5:00 in the morning. I got called by one of the fighter reps again to make sure that I was okay with that fighter going back to the ER to get checked. So, and then as luck would have it, one of my best friends ended up getting food poisoning along with his wife after going to the event. So right after I got done dealing with that, he called me telling me he wasn't feeling really good, and he's not one to complain. So I ended up going to his house and ended up taken him to urgent care and subsequently the ER. I was pretty busy Sunday, so I haven't gotten a chance to catch up with the other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there was the much talked about Artem Lobov, Paulie Malignaggi, bare knuckle boxing fight, bare knuckle fighting, whatever they.
Kind of
I
a
guess
bust, though, no? Don't you think?
it was a bust of a fight, but I think that we let ourselves get caught up in the hype. I know I was. Uh,
We all were.
I
Yeah.
also, I think I call it bare knuckle boxing, but in a sense, it's not really bare knuckle boxing. It's its own sport, bare knuckle fighting, and I think we got to take that judging a little bit maybe into account.
Yeah.
I know that there was some, arguments on the MMAcommunity.com forum about who they thought won. Officially, the judges basically gave it 3 rounds to 2 to Artem Lobov, which was an upset with the Vegas betting and
David Feldman won, the president of BKFC.
yeah. I mean, I thought Malignaggi won the fight, judging it by a boxing count. But I can also understand if they're going to call it bare knuckle fighting, why they would give it to Lobov. He
Yeah.
was more the aggressor, and I don't more the fighter, I guess you would say. Whereas Malignaggi did a lot of dancing around. He was defensive, like I said, I thought he would. He took some shots, got some nice cuts, but I felt like he landed more jabs than Lobov did damage. So it's just how you score it, whether you're
Mm.
scoring the visual damage as opposed to landing
Actually,
punches.
yeah.
So,
No, the the co-main was Chris Lieben and Cochran, right? Or no?
yeah, that was more your classic fight
So
brawl for sure.
so I gotta ask John about this as a ringside physician, just because. So obviously, Lieben has a history of there's a point where he had heart issues and stuff, and suddenly he's licensed to fight again. Um, and I kept folks that I know that were there covering the event from various outlets kept messaging me that he wasn't looking so good. I don't know if he had a bad cut or what, but knowing their history based on what you've read, as since with Lieben, for instance, would that influence you to pull him from a fight?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that was so impressive about the UFC. I didn't really express these concerns to anybody, but in my head, when I first heard that the UFC was coming and that I was going to be the lead physician, I was somewhat expecting, I guess, sort of a conspiratorial conversation with somebody from the organization to say, hey, your job is to make sure that these fights all happen. So you're going to have to ignore X, Y, and Z, and
Oh wow!
don't stop this, don't stop that. And it was 100% exactly the opposite. The lengths that the UFC goes through to make sure that that sport is as safe as it can be and their fighters are as well taken care of as possible was unbelievable. And there wasn't even a whiff, even when I did my talk with the other physicians after weigh-ins with a couple of the UFC representatives there and talked about why I would stop fights, things I would consider, who I would send to the hospital and whatnot. There wasn't even a slightest whiff of hint or anything like that from anybody from the organization that we should not stop a fight for something that we thought was necessary or things like that. It's really amazing the extent of the apparatus they have in place and how professional the people who were responsible for the athlete health and safety was. I mean, with the best example being Dr. Jeff Davidson, who's the medical director there. He wasn't able to be at the event because between working almost every event the UFC does, he travels almost every weekend, and now they've got the Contender Series, and he's the medical director for that too. So every Tuesday he's busy in Las Vegas. He couldn't be here, but he was watching every single minute of the event on TV and talking to Dana White and other officials from the UFC. He called me on a number of different times throughout the event to say things like, for instance, during the Kevin Holland fight, when the corner said, "Oh, his shoulder's out," and the commentators were talking about that, he realized that they said that before any of us were in the cage because it was right when the round ended. So as soon as I walked back out of the cage, my phone rang, and I don't normally check my phone during events, but I was like, who is it? And I was like, ooh, I better answer that. And it was him telling me that that was going on to make sure that we knew that they had that concern, and told him, yep. And I said, the guy who was looking at him was a orthopedic surgeon, and we both agreed that his shoulder was definitely not, it didn't look like it was out of joint during the round, and it certainly wasn't out of joint when we saw him. So we were happy with that. But I mean, that really, I cannot express how impressed I was with the medical staff that was there and the way they take care of folks. And it was really amazing. And I'm surprised that the UFC doesn't do a lot more to publicize how far out of their way they go to take care of their fighters. I mean, it was really amazing.
Well, that's really, I mean, that's
Yeah.
great to hear. I don't know really how else to express that, but we get so much negative stuff, and it's always what we as fans and as media guys, we always sit on all the negativity, especially when we're shooting at the biggest organization in the world. Seems like we always got something to complain about, but that's actually extremely refreshing to hear that's the case, and that's how it should be.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
And
that's just great.
and they commit a tremendous amount of money towards that as well, which is, people always are complaining about the UFC and fighter pay, but I would I would love to know how much money the UFC spent just this weekend on the medical care of their fighters, with the number of people that were there.
Yeah, it's true.
And the staff members, they have three people. The UFC has three staff members whose only job it is to manage the fighters. They have the alphabet split up between the three of them, and they know the representatives who are there know everything imaginable about those fighters and are in constant communication during their weight cuts, making sure they don't need anything. One of them actually, she was heading to the ER or to the emergency room after the event to check on one of the fighters who we had sent for a CT scan and hadn't had the CT scan yet. And I wound up going with her. And while we were sitting there, it was very clear that she had a really good relationship with that fighter, even though it's not somebody who's in her part of the alphabet. But, being willing to do that. And she was constantly in communication with her boss, and she was talking with Dr. Davidson, and he was calling me to, was the scan done? What did it show? What does she need? Asking about the scans on the other people. And it was really, really amazing the amount of stuff that they go through to do. It's great. And that is absolutely not the case with a lot of other big organizations.
Wow. Again, that's really good to hear. And I mean, not that the other organizations aren't up to par, but that the UFC is doing that. Again, we get the negativity about fighter pay and just attitudes towards fighters contracts, and
Yeah.
getting cut and everything. But to hear that's actually nice to hear. I mean, it doesn't, as a fan, it makes me feel better when I watch a fight where two people beat the living hell out of each other, to know that they're actually getting the best medical care possible is actually kind of a relief. And I mean, just from a selfish perspective, I don't feel so bad now when, I guess, maybe when I see somebody get blasted. Obviously, the UFC keeps rolling, event after event after event. Speaking of possible brain trauma, we got the event taken away from us for UFC 239, but it headlines this weekend's UFC Minneapolis card. Junior Dos Santos, Francis Ngannou. I can't think of a better heavyweight fight, really, on paper. It's one that I wanted to see live, so I'm a bit disappointed. But the fact that it's now a 5-round fight, although I don't think it's necessarily going to go that far,
No.
uh, it pretty much guarantees at this point that we're likely to see a finish. We're not going to get some kind of Lewis Ngannou situation where it's going to go to a decision after
Yeah.
some boring. I think after 5 rounds, it will be decided. But that's the big event this weekend, and then obviously the following weekend's UFC 239 and the International Fight Week. Uh, I don't know if you have had time to think about who you picking in that fight. I know most people are picking Ngannou. I think he's kind of the flavor of the month right now. Not that he's not an extremely talented fighter, but I haven't always been on his train, but I'm kind of on the new Junior Dos Santos wagon over the last few fights. I know I said I'd like to see him fight Cormier. I feel like that's a really interesting matchup, and I'm actually taking him to win this fight. I feel like he's just more the veteran, and Ngannou. Uh, I don't know if he's gonna be. He's coming off the fight with Kane where he won really quick. Prior to that, he won really quick against Blades. I feel like if he gets anything past about 2 minutes, Dos Santos is going to be able to use his boxing and eventually land something. If not against a gassed Ngannou, I just feel like he's going to end up picking up the win via TKO knockout. You
Yeah,
guys have
so
any opinions?
I, I'm going to be on the Francis train for this one. I think that his loss a couple fights ago, I think, sort of rattled him a little bit, but he clearly had his confidence back when he fought Kane. And I think he's got the right team, and I think that he's got the right attitude now to be working on what he needs to be working on. So I think you're going to see his conditioning be on point, and I think that his pacing is going to be a little bit better. He'll probably come out and try to finish it real quickly, and then if it looks like that's not going to happen, I think you'll see him settle in and do some boxing, and it'll be a really interesting fight. But I think Francis, if I were betting, that's where I would put my money on this one. But like you said, Junior's got fantastic boxing. He's looked great recently, so I'm really hoping this is going to be a good fight.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really had a chance to look at it and break it down, but if I'm thinking about, obviously Ngannou has the ability to stop it, if he lands anything early, from what we've been seeing from him. But like to Matt's point, the Junior Dos Santos as of late, I mean, he's always proven to be a durable guy. But then again, I mean, Ngannou hits really hard, so I don't know. And then I always think about the damage taken over their career, how much of that durability is left in them too. So it's a tough fight to really call when you think about it. I'm going to side with the doc, and I'm going to pick Ngannou, but I wouldn't be surprised if Dos Santos pulls a trick out of his hat and kind of like wears down Ngannou, with his other skills like jiu-jitsu and stuff. I don't think Ngannou's grappling is up to par from what I've seen, but we haven't seen him fight long enough to say that. But we do know his gas tank has suffered. So if JDS has a plan to make him work, that he's got size and reach over him. Big muscles need a lot of air, so it could go. I see ways that he could win, but I still think one shot could end it from Ngannou.
Yeah, if this were a straight boxing match, I would expect to see Junior come out and try to carry Francis for a couple of rounds. But with those itty bitty 4-ounce gloves, that's a dangerous game to play. So I'd be curious to see how he tries to tie him up. Probably keep his distance and kick a little bit, and then try to close the distance and clinch, and then back off. But I'm excited about this fight. I'm hoping it's going to be a good one.
Yeah, and I mean, it could be a huge one for Ngannou. Not only is it likely to possibly get him another title shot, but I just saw the last couple days MMA was finally legalized in France, which he's born in Cameroon, but he was raised in France. So this could not only for him, but potentially for the UFC if he ends up, whether it's for a vacant title or against Cormier or Miocic, depending on how that fight goes and whether Cormier continues his career, that could potentially open up a gigantic event in Paris or something in the very near future to make a lot of money for a lot of people in the UFC.
Yeah, it's when I saw that was legalized. That's exactly what I was thinking. It's like, wow, UFC Paris with Francis headlining for the heavyweight title is going to be an absolute ATM machine for the UFC.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That makes all the sense in the world. If you've got him in France, you got Khabib with a fight coming up now in Russia. I mean, for the global expansion that they're looking for, they got I can't how do you say her name? Is it Wang or the girl that's fighting Andrade for the strawweight title in China. I mean, there's potential to have quite the world list of champions where they can continue to travel the globe basically and have huge events. You obviously have McGregor and stuff like that if they ever wanted to try to do a giant show in
who's that guy?
Ireland. Yeah, I know. It's sad we've gotten to that point. Not always. I haven't always been a big fan of his, but I do miss the big fight feel when he fights. So who knows where he's at in his career? But anyways, so that's this weekend. That's a regular ESPN card, Ed. So you can watch that one. You don't have to hold your plus boycott. So that's this Saturday. I believe the main card, it looks like, starts at 6 o'clock Eastern time. Or actually, this might be the actual card, not the main card. The first fight of the night, 6 p.m. Eastern, according to Tapology. John, thanks for coming on. It's good to hear good things about the UFC and not always be a negative thing, but appreciate your insight. And I know I learned something, and I'm sure the rest of the listeners will as well.
Great. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
you want to throw out your Twitter handle or anything like that in case anybody wants to follow you?
So, my social media is not usually really that active, but I'm SC MMA MD on Twitter and Instagram. And most of my MMA related posting is on the MMA community, where that's my handle there, as well as the SC MMA MD.
That's the MMAcommunity.com forum. I'm also a member. That's as well as Ed. So
Yep.
one of
Links
the
are on the
best forums online. I recommend anybody check that out too.
links will be on the bottom of the YouTube video for this. But yeah, man, good stuff. Thank you.
Fans can catch us at Combat Hour on Twitter, myself at MMA Hawk 21 on Twitter and Instagram. You can follow Ed at Carbazol on Twitter and at Carbeerzol on Instagram. Look forward to the fights this week. Talking to you next week. I'll be getting ready to start heading out to Vegas. But we'll be looking forward to what is it? The LXF, is that what it is? The Lights Out organization. Sean Merriman's got a fight organization. We look to have an interview with one of his upcoming fighters next week, as well as possibly a preview for the big international fight week. So till next week, everybody, have a good one.
Peace.